As the day begins, Nyx helps Annette feed the kids, whilst Maisie continues with her research. With the temperatures outside reaching the negatives, Nyx suggests thinning the wall between the kids' bedroom and the dining hall, so that they can place a heater in the dining hall and vent the heat into the kids' room. This means that although the kids' room won't have a direct source of heat, it can receive excess heat from both Annette's bedroom and the dining hall, which should be more than enough to keep it at a safe temperature. In order to ensure that the kids' room still looks nice, they pull up some of the granite flooring from the other spare room to lay down an extra line of flooring in the kids' room. With the wiring on the south of the complex and the heater in the third mushroom grow room still needing more steel, the group head out into the streets to scavenge more up. They begin by having Nyx take apart the cars in the street to the east of the complex. As well as providing steel slag chunks for them to smelt down, getting rid of these vehicles will also clear up the sightlines around the complex a little, making it easier for the group to see if there are any dangers out in the street before they leave the complex. The dismantling of the vehicles takes most of the day, with Annette and Maisie watching over Nyx as she works. By the end they have a nice haul of steel chunks to smelt down though, so the trip is a big success. The next morning, the group wastes no time in putting the steel to use, to finish wiring up the new heater, and, following that, they experience another big win. The first harvest of mushrooms is ready to go, and Annette and Nyx get to work gathering it all up. With the mushrooms harvested and winter approaching, the group decide that having a freezer would be very helpful. The last thing they need is for their small food stockpile going bad in the middle of winter, when they wouldn't be able to replace it. With the temperatures already below freezing, a freezer would be as simple as having a room to store the food in, without the need to manually control the temperature. Figuring that the freezer would be best placed near the stove to avoid too much running back and forth for whoever was doing the cooking, the group moved Maisie's bed into a different room and began repurposing her old bedroom into the complex's new walk-in freezer. The next morning, just as the group are waking up and removing the sand from their eyes, there's an explosion overhead which shakes the very foundations of the complex. This explosion is followed by a low, loud whistling sound, and, turning their eyes to the sky, the group see a spacecraft with visible damage soar over them, its trajectory making it clear that it's on a fast track for a collision with the ground. The group get together to discuss the events of the morning. Nyx is familiar with spacecraft, having spent some time on one growing up. She was confident that, although damaged, the ship would likely be mostly intact after the crash. They were designed in such a way that, if they crashed into the ground, it was usually as soft as possible, to prevent damage to cities or environments. Nyx was certain that, if they could make their way to the crash site, they could get the ship up and running again, or at the very least find a transport shuttle aboard it that they could use to get off of this ravaged planet. Maisie was much more hesitant. She knew their position was perilous, but the last few days had shown that they could survive here, and she felt as though they had a better chance of making a new life here than they would venturing out into the world with the hopes of finding the crash site. The trajectory of the ship had suggested that it would crash a long distance away, and Maisie wasn't sure she wanted to leave the relative safety of the complex for such a low chance of escape. They both looked to Annette to be the deciding vote. But with 3 newborn kids and winter on the horizon, Annette had more pressing concerns. She suggested that, regardless of whether they wanted to go and find the ship or not, they were currently in no position to do so. Such a journey would require a lot of food, additional protection, and some form of transport. They would stand no chance if they tried to walk across the entire planet. In either case, these were things that they currently didn't have access to. So, for the moment, instead of making any decision on the plan to find the ship, Annette suggested that they focus on making it through the winter and improving their options by continuing to advance their research and food supplies. Reluctantly accepting the wisdom in Annette's words, Nyx agrees to put the plan on finding the ship on the back burner, at least until they can get themselves in a safer position. That night, the unexpected sounds continue, as the group hear some travelling survivors outside of the complex. And then they hear them shooting outside the complex. Eager to see if they can source any more electrical components, given that they are very short on them, Nyx ventures out to see if they're willing to trade, before the infected can rip them to pieces. Unfortunately, they don't have any components, but she is able to barter a few of the weapons they've collected from fallen travellers in exchange for some medicine. It never hurts to stockpile some meds. With steel still in short supply, Nyx then moves on to tearing down more old vehicles in the streets. After gathering and processing some more of the steel, the group decide to invest in a second solar panel. With them relying on electrical heaters and the temperatures continuing to drop, it'd be helpful to ensure they had enough power to keep the heaters on during the night, and their current single solar panel setup was struggling to fill up the battery each day. Outside, the travellers had their own solution to keeping warm, namely the flamethrower they were using to incinerate the infected. Deciding that a more ample wood supply would allow them to build some furniture to improve their living experience, and also provide a nice supply should they require a fire to keep them extra toasty in the cold winter, the group ventured out to the building to the east, with Annette harvesting all of the large mushrooms there, whilst Maisie and Nyx stood guard. Realising that there was wasted wood in the form of the fences and the shed, Nyx began tearing those down too, to repurpose them. She made sure to leave some of the outer fence though. Who knows, maybe one day they'd have need of a small animal pen. The shed had clearly originally served as somebody's art studio, and in the interest of not wasting anything, the group carried the art bench back to the complex, in case they one day decided to create some art to adorn the complex. With most of Nyx's workload being dependent on the need to sow crops or build things, she often found herself with nothing on her to-do list, whilst Maisie researched and Annette cooked. As such, she had taken to spending a lot of time looking after the children, even taking turns playing with and feeding them. With their new wood supplies, the group also planned to build a small school for the kids, ready for them to be old enough to start classes. The desks, chairs and blackboards would all require plenty of wood. To make this possible, they planned to open up the kids' bedroom to fit the classroom in there, meaning they didn't have to worry about heating a separate room. They did also reinforce the outer wall, as none of them felt very safe in its construction. With the leftover wood, they elected to build bedside tables for everyone, to make their rooms somewhat less barren and depressing. With the temperatures outside now reaching a frigid -20, frostbite was starting to become an issue, and with it came infection risks. Annette was soon struck down by such an infection and a bit of tissue in her finger which had been damaged by frostbite. Nyx did her best to tend Annette's infection, but she was definitely not medically skilled. Even with a couple of days of bed rest, the infection was winning out over Annette's immune system, compromised as it was by the cold. Even with the heater, her bedroom was struggling to keep a heat, sitting at around 7 degrees. With it becoming clear that Annette couldn't beat the infection, Nyx and Annette took a drastic decision to amputate the infected finger before the infection could spread. Surprisingly, Nyx managed to make the cut a clean one, and they managed to get Annette back on her feet. But between this and the infected that had ripped off her thumb, Annette's hands were taking a real beating in this apocalypse. With the temperature becoming a major issue, the group would need to make effective use of the few electrical heaters that they had. To this end, Maisie and Nyx decided that they should move into Nyx's room. This would allow them to build a simple vent between this room and the mushroom growing room next door, allowing them to have a source of heat for their bedroom. As well as this, they would need to add a heater to the dining hall, to give them a warm place to spend time together. But with everyone walking in and out of the dining hall all day, plus the amount of traffic in and out of the kids' bedroom, it would end up letting a lot of heat out into the outdoors. To try and minimise this, Nyx suggested building a small airlock between the two rooms, meaning less heat would be lost from the rooms when the doors were opened. With Maisie beginning to suffer from hypothermia due to their heating issues, Annette took a little bit of a drastic step, venturing out into the streets to pull the clothes off of a nearby corpse. The clothes were disgusting and smelled awful, but they were warmer than the ones Maisie had, so she would just need to grin and bear it for the time being. Survival was more important to them than happiness for the moment. With her stinky new clothes, she was significantly more able to handle the massively negative temperatures, which were approaching -30 outside. With the temperatures so incredibly low, the single heater in the mushroom grow room to the north was no longer able to keep the room above freezing, which also meant it definitely couldn't heat Maisie and Nyx's bedroom. Nyx began drawing up plans to make another airlock of sorts, to encompass the north grow room, their bedroom, and the east grow room, to try and maintain a high enough temperature to continue growing in both of the rooms. It would also include the outhouse, giving them a slightly warmer place in which to poop. This airlock would need to be a lot bigger than the one between Annette's room and the dining hall, but should allow for a much more stable environment with much better temperature control. The next couple of days were quite slow, as the group tried to piece together a heating solution to keep them going through the winter. But things soon became worse when, during a mental breakdown, Annette became catatonic. Thankfully, Nyx had completed the second airlock, so she could take over the childcare duties from Annette, whilst Maisie took over the cooking duties. Maisie wasn't exactly good at cooking, but someone had to do it whilst Annette recovered, and Maisie's only other task was her research, so she could afford to spend a little time each day doing something else. It would slow down their overall progress, but slowing down seemed to be the theme of this winter, so they accepted their new roles stoically and continued onward. With the temperatures being as bad as they were, the mushrooms still weren't growing, despite the addition of the airlocks. It was with a sigh that Nyx finally accepted that she'd need to use more of their stockpiled components to create more heaters. To this end, Maisie and Nyx ventured out into the street to scavenge more steel for the new heaters. They started with new heaters in the north and east grow rooms. 2 would surely be plenty to keep them at temperature, even with the north room sharing its heat with Maisie and Nyx's bedroom. Although they'd been stung before by Clomster, when another survivor contacted them to ask to join them, Nyx and Maisie agreed. They really did want to help as many people as they could. Plus, with Annette currently incapacitated, they could definitely use the help. And so it was that Yuso joined their numbers. After a thorough inspection, they were confident she wasn't secretly infected. Sadly, she also didn't seem to have an abundance of useful skills. It would be sensible to start training Yuso in some of the other skills that would be required for survival, to account for the times when their current expert in a skill might not be available. Yuso's first day with the group was a trial by fire, as Nyx ventured out to dismantle more vehicles and required Yuso to keep overwatch with Maisie. Yuso had been looking forward to getting to enjoy the safety of the complex after days of wandering this dangerous world on her own, but she understood the importance of the task and was eager to prove her worth to her new group. The infected were kind enough to give her the perfect opportunity to, as a couple of aggressive infected approached their position, giving Yuso a chance to take them down. Before long, they all returned with their haul, introducing Yuso to the complex for the first time. In the interest of making sure she had somewhere warm to sleep, Nyx and Maisie decided it'd be best to build another bed in their bedroom. They hadn't planned for it to turn into a makeshift barracks, but the seasonal temperatures had somewhat forced their hand. Thankfully, the mixture of the airlocks and the extra heaters seemed to be doing their job, and the temperatures were evening out a little in the complex. The bustle around Yuso's arrival had stirred Annette from her breakdown, and she came to her senses once again, introducing herself to Yuso with glee, happy to see that they'd managed to find another survivor. Following a night of hearing blistering winds whipping by in the night, the group awoke to find the ground covered in a little smattering of snow. It would have been quite beautiful if it wasn't also serving as a reminder of the danger that the temperatures posed. With both Yuso and Nyx having some spare time, Nyx suggested that they venture out to explore the rooms of the nearby buildings, to see if there's anything worth salvaging. Much as with their own building, it was just a collection of broken down old things, but Nyx was able to gather up some steel from the process, so the adventure did yield results. The group had managed to also add a second heater to the southern grow room, but with so many heaters now running, their power grid was struggling to keep up. So for the time being, they turned off the 2 in the south room. Since it didn't have an airlock, it seemed the most sensible to turn off, as it would be the hardest to keep at temperature for the time being. With Maisie already resorting to wearing clothes pulled from a dead person, Annette suggested that they free up some space in one of the grow rooms to grow mycothread mushrooms. These mushrooms produced a fibrous substance which could be tailored into clothes, allowing them to produce their own clothing to keep them warm. Hopefully by the time next winter rolled around at least. Although the solar panels worked out great, having such long nights in winter meant that there simply wasn't enough hours of daylight to store enough power to keep the electricity flowing overnight. To try and remedy this, Nick suggested that they build a wind turbine in the courtyard. It would take up quite a lot of space and would have its own reliability issues, only being able to produce whenever there was a strong enough wind, but the upside was that there was still wind at night, meaning that their grid would be producing a little electricity at night to offset the drain from the heaters. Perhaps the greatest danger involved in this plan, however, was that building the turbine would use the last of their components, putting them in a very precarious position should any of their equipment break down and require a component to be replaced to fix it. Venturing out into the snow to dismantle more vehicles, the group finally found an upside to the winter temperatures. It looks as though the hypothermia was also affecting the infected, causing them to slow down to the point of no longer being a danger. With that knowledge, it would be a lot safer to be out in the streets during such cold temperatures, and would be the perfect time for them to go out and scavenge, whilst the danger of being ambushed by the infected was minimised. Deciding that this was too good of an opportunity to pass up, the group decided that now would be the perfect time for them to expand the complex, merging it with another one of the nearby buildings. After a brief inspection of the surrounding buildings, they decided to expand to the west, incorporating the building across the street into their complex. Next began planning out walls to enclose the new space, along with planning out a new exit from their current space through the west of the complex. In order to get enough stone bricks together to manage to enclose the newly expanded space, the group started by tearing down the garage and small stone shed in the courtyard of the western building. Most of the group spread out to ensure they'd have advanced warning of any aggressive infected, whilst Nick's got to work tearing down the buildings. The next morning, after enjoying a spot of breakfast and ensuring that the kids were fed, the whole group ventured back out to the west to continue the project. Progress was slow, with Nix being the sole builder, hauler and dismantler, so that the others could keep watch. Given that the intense cold made the infected less of an issue, however, Yuso holstered her gun and got stuck in, helping to dismantle the garage and hauling the bricks to the wall, ready for Nix to build them. The next morning, whilst the group were prepping for another day on the expansion project, Maisie finished up the last bits of her research into basic motor vehicles. She'd been quite secretive over what she'd been researching, but she explained to the group that she felt as though if they had a vehicle, they could more easily venture out from the city to collect additional resources from the surrounding areas, as it would be both faster and less exposed to the infected than if they were to walk. She also suggested that, since they were expanding to the second building, it was the perfect time to try and build a garage in the new area where they could store and work on a vehicle. With the relative safety of the project and Annette struggling with the cold, the group decided to let her stay in the complex while they continued the project. She could spend the time keeping the things going in the complex, cooking, feeding the kids and harvesting the crop, whilst the others worked on the expansion. By the end of the day, they'd finally managed to finish up the north wall and could begin working on the southern wall. On the fourth day of the project, Yuso and Nix closed off the small opening to the west, before moving on to finishing out the southern wall. Yuso wasn't great at construction, but Nix was trying to train her up, to help speed up future projects, and also to give the group a fallback in case anything were to happen to Nix. It was a bit of a morbid thought, but an effective one, and they couldn't afford to shy away from harsh realities in their current situation. Realising that they'll need a few more bricks to finish up the southern wall, they also began dismantling one of the outer rooms of the western building to repurpose its bricks. As they were working away the next day, Yuso, who'd clearly been struggling a bit with this new life, found some smoke leaf joints that one of the dead travellers had dropped and decided to go on a bit of a binge. The rest of the group would need to keep a careful watch on her while she was dazed, to make sure she didn't wander off into trouble, but they could finish out the project without her for now. And finish it out they did. By the end of the day, the southern wall was completed, and the new area was completely enclosed. They would still have to take extra time to slowly and methodically clear out all of the rooms of the new building and brick up any doorways, but now they had a much larger area to work with. With the area under their control, however, there was a few other tasks to complete first. There were a lot of vehicles abandoned in the new area, which next needed to dismantle to both claim their steel and also clear up the space for other projects. Just as she was finishing that up, Yuso, whose only real skill was animal handling, swore she heard the sound of some yaks bleating from a few streets over. She convinced the others that they could utilise their newfound space as a pen where the yaks could graze, and in return they could get milk from them. Although Yuso mostly just wanted to have some animals around and to save the poor yak from the infected, if they were being honest with themselves, the rest of the group would appreciate the company of the animals too. To that end, the whole group ventured out into the streets, following the last known sound of the yaks. Before long, they found a single male yak wandering the streets. Yuso roped it and started leading it back to the complex, with a net going with her to keep them safe. Yuso was insistent that she'd heard more than one yak, however, so Maisie and Nick stayed out a little bit longer, looking for any further signs. After a bit more searching, in the furthest corner of the city they found a female yak wandering alone. Excited at the prospect of being able to raise even more yak, Nick roped it up and started leading it back, with Maisie offering protection. Before long they had both the yak back in the complex, and their little group had grown that little bit bigger. The next morning, the next step in claiming the new land was put into action, namely removing all of the infected corpses from the area. Over the months, many infected had been killed by travellers, and their corpses were now strewn across the ground, which wasn't a great sight to see every day. The group began hauling them outside of the walls, where they wouldn't be subjected to the sight of them every day. Unfortunately, dealing with all the bodies, mixed with the generally back-breaking work of the project for the last few weeks, had taken its toll on Nyx, and she had a bit of a breakdown, deciding that the best solution to her feelings would be to enact some violence against Yuso. Thankfully, whilst Yuso ran Nyx in circles, Annette was able to catch up to her and subdue her, locking her away in a spare room for a bit until she'd calmed down. It wasn't long before some infected decided to test the walls of the new expansion, and tore down one of the southern wall's doors. Thankfully, Yuso and Nyx were nearby and able to dispatch the infected, but having the stone bricks in the door destroyed was aggravating, as they were still very much a limited resource for the group. Figuring that they'd probably be replacing the door semi-regularly, Nyx decided to dismantle another section of the new building in order to stockpile some more bricks in preparation for their repairs. Sure enough, the very next day, before she could even begin dismantling that room, some more infected started bashing on the southern wall once again. Yuso was able to put it down before it broke through though, but the constant desire of the infected to ruin her hard work was really starting to get Nyx worked up. The hope was that, in the summer, the exterior courtyard where the yak lived would be able to provide enough nutrition for them by just letting them graze on the grass. Whilst the winter was in full swing, however, and the ground was still covered in snow, the group felt it best to give the yak access to their freezer, so that they could help themselves to some of the group's stockpiled mushrooms. Before long, Yuso managed to retrieve their first bucket of yak milk, giving the group a nice little variety to their mostly mushroom diet. Unfortunately, this success was short-lived, as for the third day in a row, the infected tried to burst through the southern wall, this time succeeding in destroying another door. Yuso managed to distract the infected so that it didn't attack the yak, whilst Annette closed in behind it to shoot it down. The infected did take a swing at Yuso, but thankfully it never broke the skin. Unfortunately, with the door down, another infected entered the complex, looking to attack the yak. The yak was able to avoid it, but unfortunately it escaped out of the complex and back into the streets. A masterful shot from Annette put the infected down, and Annette and Yuso both gave chase to the yak, grabbing it and dragging it back to the complex. Whilst they were doing this, yet another infected rushed in, looking to steal some of their hard-earned yak milk. Annette managed to deftly put this one down too, saving their precious milk and keeping everyone safe for another day. With the doors on the new walls completed, the group decided to brick up their old doors in the airlocks, deciding that the old airlocks could be converted into bedrooms again for the group, allowing Maisie, Nix and Yuso to finally have their own rooms again. After dealing with a further not one, but two separate attacks on the southern doors, Nix gave in and replaced the doors with solid walls instead, hoping that that might deter the constant attacks and wasted resources on the southern wall. Although it had been covered in snow since they gained access to it, there was some steel reinforced concrete floors in the new section of the complex, which Nix decided to rip up in order to get access to the steel. With the bigger area they now had to keep an eye on, Maisie began researching how to make CCTV cameras, in the hopes that doing so would help them keep a closer watch on the outer walls, since the infected seemed so intent on attacking them. As if on cue, an infected started attacking the northern gates. Replacing the gates to the south with solid walls did seem to have deterred them from attacking there, but it seemed they'd now somehow found the way to the northern gates, and the group couldn't brick over every door as they needed to be able to leave the complex to scavenge. So for now, they'd have to settle for rebuilding the doors, and maybe trying to think of ways to stop the infected before they could destroy the doors. With the two new bedrooms having previously had their floors ripped out, the group wanted to build some new ones, to make the rooms a little more bearable. There was a crop of trees in the courtyard of one of the buildings to the north, so Nix, Annette and Yuso ventured out so that Annette could harvest all of the trees and they could put wooden floorboards back in their rooms. The next morning, it seemed that winter was finally coming to an end, as Annette was able to begin planting their outside fields once again, meaning that the group could start looking forward to a little more variety in their diets once more, beyond mushrooms and milk. With things finally calming down a little, Nix began planning out a garage for them to start constructing their vehicle. As they still hadn't explored a lot of the new rooms in the western building, they tore down a few walls in one of the rooms they had explored and made it into one big garage. While discussing the issue of their lack of components the night before, Yuso had mentioned that on her way to join them at the complex, she had noticed some damaged chunks of spacecraft on the outskirts of town, and asked Nix if she thought she could retrieve any valuable components from it. Nix wasn't certain, but agreed that it was worth a try. So the next morning, Nix, Maisie and Yuso all headed out to the outskirts of town to see what they could achieve. Much to Nix's glee, she was able to retrieve a good number of components from each of the chunks, which massively replenished their stockpiles. This was super helpful, especially if the group wanted to build their own vehicle, which would require a lot of components. Running power to the garage, Nix utilised some of the new components to build a workbench, along with a refinery which would allow them to turn organic material into fuel for the vehicle. With all of this, she was able to start building a list of things they would need to build themselves an armoured truck that could keep them protected whilst they venture out into the world to gather up more materials. With winter survived, their available space more than doubled, a nice little family of yak beginning to grow, and dreams of a vehicle seeming closer than ever, the group ended winter with a little more hope in their hearts. Hey guys, Tuna here, thank you so much for watching. Things are starting to feel like they're actually picking up speed for this series, and I'm very excited to see where it all goes. I shall have the next episode out soon, so please do hit the subscribe button if you want to be notified when that comes out. Or feel free to join us in the Discord with the link down in the doobly-doo, just to be kept up to date on videos and to chat nonsense with us. Until next time, I hope life treats you all wonderfully, and I will see you shortly. Bye bye!